Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Grace, and this is my colleague, Gracie. So it's okay if you call us either one. Probably both of us will respond. I do come from District Health Department world, and I recently, about a year ago, started working at the Regional Prevention Center. So we are going to shift gears a little bit. We've been talking about substance use, we've been talking about grant writing and different things like that, but we are going to move into talking about suicide prevention. There is a very strong correlation between substance use and suicide, so that's why it's very important for us to talk about this today. Before we get into it, a little disclaimer, we are going to be talking about suicide. This is a heavy topic, so if you need to step out at any time, if you need to step to the back, do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. We just want you to know that that's important. Today, we're going to teach you three easy steps that you can walk through if you are faced with a situation where you think someone is thinking about dying by suicide. The first step is to ask them the suicide question. The second step is to persuade them to seek and accept help. And the third step is to then refer them to appropriate help. So you will walk away today having a greater understanding of how to help someone who is thinking about dying by suicide. And what we're going to speak to you about today is evidence-based. After today, you will be a gatekeeper in suicide prevention. And a gatekeeper just means that you are equipped to help someone who might be thinking about dying by suicide. Gatekeepers can be anyone. Anyone can help a person who is thinking about dying by suicide. It can be friends, family. You don't have to be licensed. You don't have to be a therapist. So we want you to feel empowered after this training. What can you expect from this training? You can expect that you will have a greater awareness and understanding about suicide. We are going to dispel some common myths, things that people generally believe about suicide that just aren't true. We're going to go through some facts. You will be able to pick up on warning signs, on clues that someone in your life or in your circle of influence might be thinking about dying by suicide. And then again, you're going to be able to walk through those three steps that I just mentioned to you at the end of this training. So while suicide is a leading cause of death in the United States, it is also the most preventable cause of death in the United States or in the world. Almost any positive action can save a life. So I want to thank you for being in this room today. Thank you for taking the time to listen so that you could hopefully save someone's life. We also know that suicide is not the problem. It is only the solution, or I like to say the perceived solution to a perceived insolvable problem. To someone who is experiencing suicidal ideation, suicide to them just may seem like their last choice. It may seem like the only thing that they can do to escape the pain that they're feeling. What we're going to discuss today is not a form of counseling. We are not therapists. I believe we do have some licensed therapists and counselors in the room. That is not what we are. That's not what we're doing. And this is not a form of treatment. Instead, we are setting out to offer hope through positive action. Sometimes people fear intervening in a situation where they think that someone might be thinking about dying by suicide because they're worried about liability. But what we want you to know is that there have been more than 3 million people who have been trained in steps like this, that 3-step process, and there have been no liability issues. No legal actions have been taken because we do have Good Samaritan laws in place that protect gatekeepers like you who would intervene in an attempt to save a life. Something that we're doing in prevention work is changing the way that we speak, changing the way that we talk about suicide. So I want to briefly mention some changes that we're trying to work on in suicide prevention. We know that our words have the possibility to help, but we also know that our words can do harm. And the way that we speak about suicide can actually increase the stigma that there already is around suicide. Over the past 2 decades, we've been changing our language to try to reduce the stigma around suicide. And the language that I'm going to be discussing today is by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. The biggest change is how we talk about suicide as a cause of death. So probably everyone in this room has heard someone say that they committed suicide. That person committed suicide. But you've heard me say several times already, died by suicide. So we are moving from committed, which sounds like a criminal act, to died by suicide. We are also moving from completed suicide to died by suicide because completed has a positive annotation and we don't want to make that connection. We know that completed implies that the act has been accomplished or successful, which sends the message that suicide is a task to be accomplished. So instead, we want to say died by suicide. And the same is true for failed attempt and successful attempt. Instead, we want to say that that person survived an attempt or that they died by suicide. This language can be really important, especially for survivors of suicide. Survivors of suicide I'll define for you in a few slides, but those are the people who loved that person, those blood relatives. So if someone in their family did die by suicide, our language around how we discuss that is important to their healing process. So we just want to remember that we use person-first language that is free of judgment, and of course, have grace for yourself, because as with anything, if you're trying to change the way you speak about something, it can take a little bit of time. Now I'd like to tell you a story about a bridge. This bridge is a very popular bridge. Over 2,000 people have died by jumping off of this bridge. Only 1% have survived. There's a 245-foot drop off of this bridge. And today, there are people who are stationed on that bridge who are trained in suicide prevention. There are also phones along the bridge, throughout the bridge, that someone can go to and pick up, and they will automatically be directed to the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. These are some quotes from people who are part of that 1% who survived a jump off of that bridge. I instantly realized that everything in my life that I thought was unfixable was totally fixable, except for the fact that I just jumped. It is a corrective emotional experience, and the millisecond my hands left the rail, it was instant regret. Any ideas about what bridge I'm referring to? The Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. Yes. Very good. That is the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. So now I'd like to tell you a story about a guy named Kevin Hines. Kevin was born premature, and he was born already addicted to substances. He was already addicted to drugs. He had a pretty tough time as a child, moving from home to home, until eventually he landed in a pretty secure environment with a pretty secure family. However, when Kevin turned 17, he began to experience a whole lot of mental health issues. He began to experience paranoia and mania. He was diagnosed bipolar, and he began to experience hallucinations. His paranoia was so strong that he felt like he was hearing voices telling him that he needed to kill himself, and eventually he began to believe those voices. Kevin was spiraling out of control, and this ultimately led Kevin to make a decision that he wanted to end his life by suicide and jump off of the Golden Gate Bridge. The night before Kevin's attempt, he wrote a suicide note, and he left that note on his nightstand. When Kevin woke up in the morning, he had some doubts about ending his life that day. So he made a deal with himself. If someone stopped him on his way to the bridge and asked him if he was okay, he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't follow through. Kevin got on a bus, visibly upset, and made his way to the Golden Gate Bridge. Once he arrived at the bridge, he walked down the walkway and thought, this is it. Is anybody going to ask me if I'm okay? I don't want to do this, but I feel like this is my only option. And a woman stopped him. And she said, "Will you take my picture?" And she took his picture. He took her picture, and she walked away. And Kevin jumped. Kevin thought nobody cared. As soon as he jumped, he had the same thought that about 19 other survivors had, and that was the millisecond, that quote, "the millisecond my hands left the rail." It was just instant regret. He remembers thinking, nobody is going to know that I didn't want to die. He didn't want to die. In 4 seconds, Kevin fell 75 miles an hour, 25 stories. After the fall, the Coast Guard retrieved him, miraculously alive, but seriously injured. We share this story because Kevin was visibly upset. There were some really loud warning signs that he was not okay. And there were a whole lot of people who missed an opportunity to ask him that question that may have resulted in him not ever jumping off that bridge. Our focus today is how one person can make a difference by taking action. These are some statistics about the public health impact of suicide. So we know that for the population of people who are between ages 10 to 34, the second suicide is the second leading cause of death for that age group. In 2020 alone, 12.2 million people seriously thought about suicide, 3.2 million people made a plan, and then 1.2 million people followed through and attempted suicide, which resulted in almost 46,000 deaths by suicide in 2020 alone. As a state, we rank 18th in the nation for our high suicide rate. These are, you don't have it on your thing. So I told you for 10 to 34, suicide was the second leading cause of death. For ages 35 to 44, suicide is the fourth leading cause of death. For 45 to 54, it is the seventh leading cause of death. For 55 to 64, it's the ninth. And for those who are 65 years of age or older, it is the 17th leading cause of death. And in Kentucky, overall, suicide is the 11th leading cause of death. And this chart... We can't write that fast. Oh, I'm so sorry, yes. So for 10 through 34, it's the second. For 35 through 44, it's the fourth. For 45 through 54, it is the seventh. For 55 through 64, the ninth. And for 65 plus, the 17th. Thank you. Absolutely. This chart is going to show you suicide deaths over the years. So take a look at that. And you can't see these previous years down here, but from 2000 to 2018, we saw a 30% increase. A 30% increase in suicide deaths over the years in the United States. And then in 2019 to 2020, we actually see a 5.6% decline. However, there is some discussion out there regarding if COVID played a factor in reporting. Just wanted to make that known. We know also that suicide rates do vary by demographics. So we have the highest suicide rates among those who are non-Hispanic, American, Indian, or Alaskan Native, and non-Hispanic white people. We also know that some occupational groups have higher rates of suicide. We see that in construction workers and in miners. We also know that people who live in rural areas have significantly higher suicide rates compared to urban areas, and young people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual also have higher rates of suicidal thoughts. There's also a correlation between males and females. So what we know is that females have higher rates of attempting suicide, while males have a higher rate of dying by suicide. And that is because males tend to use more lethal methods. I mentioned an increased risk for the LGBTQ population. Suicide risk is thought to be the highest during the teen years and the early 20s. And for those LGBTQ youth, 42% seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year. They are also more likely to experience depression or suicidality. One of the reasons we see these issues in this population is because of the family rejection. 8.4 LGBT youth who experience rejection from their families are 8.4 times as likely to have attempted suicide as their LGBT peers who did not experience rejection by their families. Discrimination, lack of access to affirming care, and family rejection are related to an elevated risk of suicide in this people group. And this graphic is going to show you estimates of attempted suicide. So there are 25 suicide attempts for each documented death by suicide. So we mentioned that there were about 46,000 deaths in 2020 by suicide. That translates to 1 million attempts that year. I mentioned suicide survivors to you. This is another people group that we need to talk about because suicide does not just affect the person who died by suicide. There are suicide survivors, and those are the blood relatives of someone who has died by suicide. About 6 blood relatives are directly related to each suicide. This number, however, does not include colleagues or friends or coworkers, only blood relatives. So there are even more people who are affected by suicide. If roughly 40,000 Americans die by suicide in a year, that leaves 240,000 blood relative survivors. And whenever someone becomes a suicide survivor, their risk for suicide themselves, for dying by suicide themselves, actually increases. The University of Kentucky did a study on suicide survivors. And here is what happens when one person dies by suicide, along with those people becoming suicide survivors who are blood relatives. There are 135 people exposed, 53 people experience short-term disruption in their life, 25 people have a major life disruption, and then 11 people have devastating effects. So there are major impacts. The impacts can be even greater in rural, tight-knit communities, and that's what we have here in Western Kentucky. Let's discuss some of these myths and facts. No one can stop a suicide. It is inevitable. That is not the truth. That is false. Especially in youth, we see that if a youth who is thinking about dying by suicide, if that youth receives help, it is likely that they will probably never have suicide ideation again. Confronting a person about suicide will only make them angry, and it will increase the risk that they might die by suicide. That is not the truth. That is a myth. Asking someone directly, and Gracie will expand on this, asking someone directly, are you thinking about killing yourself, is actually a deterrent. It reduces anxiety, and it opens up that door for that person who might just not have been able to get those words out. Some people say only experts can help with suicide. You know, I'm not qualified to talk about that. I wouldn't know what to say. That's not the case. We know that any positive action can help save a life, and we want you to walk away today feeling empowered about that. It's everybody's business. And some people believe that suicidal people keep their plans to themselves. This is actually not the truth. This is a myth. Most suicidal people, and there's a typo on this and my OCD is like, but I'll fix that later. Most suicidal people actually communicate their intent sometime during the week preceding their suicide attempt. So it might not be, hey, I'm thinking about killing myself, but we are going to tell you what to look for, some clues and some warning signs that someone is thinking about dying by suicide. Some people say if they're talking about it, they're not going to do it. Again, another myth. People who talk about suicide may attempt suicide or an act of self-destruction. And once a person decides to die by suicide, there is nothing that anyone can do. That's not the truth. Suicide is the most preventable cause of death, and almost any positive action can save a life. The more signs and clues that you observe in someone that they might be thinking about dying by suicide, the greater the risk. So we want to make sure that we take all of the signs and clues that someone is experiencing seriously. And these are the strongest predictor that someone might be thinking about dying by suicide. If they have previously attempted suicide, if they are talking about making a plan, if they're experiencing any form of depression, hopelessness, or extreme withdrawal, substance use is a strong indicator, especially for someone who has never been using a substance. They pick that up, they're using it a lot. And a recent attempt by a family or a friend. There's also a correlation between self-injury and suicide. So self-injury is intentional, non-life-threatening bodily injury or disfigurement. 40% of people who engage in self-injury have additional thoughts of suicide, although their self-injury is not necessarily them trying to die by suicide in that moment. And 50 to 85% of those who have injured themselves have attempted suicide at least once in their lifetime. And Gracie is going to pick up and continue with our presentation.
Y'all just learned about what predictors can increase someone's risk. So now I'm going to teach y'all some of the clues to look for. So you're going to learn some direct and indirect verbal clues, as well as behavioral clues and situations that might indicate someone is thinking about suicide. So there are a couple of direct verbal clues to be aware of when someone is considering suicide. And these statements don't really require you to dig any further into what they're meaning. They are pretty direct. And so if someone uses one of these statements, it is important that you take them serious and get them help right away. So some that you might hear are, I've decided to kill myself, I wish I were dead, I'm going to commit suicide, I'm going to end it all, if such and such doesn't happen, I will kill myself. And we often see that last one in young people who are going through their first heartbreak. To them, it may seem like the end of the world because their brains are not developed enough to cope with those emotions. So it's common for people not to take them seriously. However, it's important that if you hear that verbal clue from them, pay attention and help them. And I do want to mention these are statements from people who all ended up dying by suicide. And so we were given these statements from families who were told these. So there are also some indirect verbal clues that might indicate someone is considering suicide. So these require you to follow up and ask for a better understanding of what they meant. So some that you might hear are, I'm tired of life, I just can't go on. My family would be better off without me. Who cares if I'm dead anyway? I just want out. I won't be around much longer. Pretty soon, you won't have to worry about me. So if you hear any of these statements, just follow up and ask them more questions. It's important to pay attention and just always ask for more information if you are unsure. So there are also many behavioral clues that someone is considering dying by suicide. So if you notice any of these behaviors, you should investigate. So if you see any previous suicide attempts, acquiring a gun or stockpiling pills, co-occurring depression, moodiness, hopelessness, if they're putting personal affairs in order, or they're giving away prized possessions, they have a sudden interest or disinterest in religion, they have a drug or alcohol abuse or relapse after a period of recovery, or unexplained anger. So if you see any of these behaviors, you start investigating into what's going on, because there might be something else going on behind. So finally, there's also situation clues, or situations that occur in a person's life that could set the thoughts of suicide in motion or increase the risk. So if someone is fired or expelled from school, had a recent unwanted move, loss of any major relationship, death of a spouse, child, best friend, especially if by suicide, diagnosis of a serious or terminal illness, sudden unexpected loss of freedom, fear of punishment, anticipated loss of financial security, or loss of a cherished therapist, counselor, teacher, or fear of becoming a burden to others. So these are some situations that could increase their risk. So as Grace mentioned, there are 3 steps that you can take that can save someone's life potentially. And so the first step is to question that individual that's considering suicide. So if you notice some of those clues or situations from a person, this is a time where you need to talk to them and figure out if they are considering dying by suicide. So how to ask the question. There are 2 approaches on how to ask, a less direct or a direct approach. So if you're not comfortable asking it directly, you might want to start with the less direct. These questions will eventually lead to that direct approach answer. So it might sound like, have you been unhappy lately? Have you been very unhappy lately? Have you been so unhappy lately that you've been thinking about ending your life? Do you ever wish you could go to sleep and never wake up? So when you ask these questions, they kind of start that conversation, and they'll eventually lead into that direct approach answer. Now, if you want to ask directly, so those might sound like, when people are as upset as you seem to be, they sometimes wish they were dead. I'm wondering if you're feeling that way too. You look pretty miserable. I wonder if you're thinking about suicide. Are you thinking about killing yourself? So using these questions will allow you to get a clear answer. You'll either get a yes or no. And the person is less likely to get out of the conversation if you ask this way. And if you can't ask the question, just find someone who can. If you did not think you can help the person, just always make sure to find someone, because you just need to, some people, it's just they can't. And so just find someone who could help you. So here are some tips for asking the question. So if in doubt, don't wait, ask the question. If the person is reluctant, be persistent. You may want to invite that person into a private setting and allow them to talk freely. Making the person feel safe is very important. If you know you're only going to have a few minutes to talk, it's probably not the best time to ask the question. Block out time to have this discussion, or find another person to ask the question in emergency situations. They need your full attention. And that's very important. If you do not think you have enough time, you only have 5 minutes, go find someone who has more time, because that person needs to feel like they are your full attention. And then have your resources handy. You want to have the Suicide National Prevention Lifeline on hand, and be knowledgeable of the community resources as well. And we will talk about those in a minute. And then it's important to remember that how you ask the question is less important than that you ask it. But with that being said, here are some ways on how to not ask the question. So, when asking people questions about suicide, your tone is very important. We want that person to trust us and open up to us. So we don't want to say, "You're not thinking about suicide, are you? You're just kidding about suicide, about killing yourself, right?" Asking in this way encourages a negative response from the young person that you are talking with. It may also imply that you are frightened by the intensity of their feelings. And then you also want to be aware of your own nonverbal clues. So we might be nervous, but we want to appear calm to the person because we're trying to make them feel as comfortable as possible. And then finally, we never pass judgment on a person thinking about suicide, and we never tell them not to tell us the truth. So the next step is to persuade. So if the person is considering dying by suicide, we should then persuade that person to seek and accept help. So to persuade the individual to get help, you want to listen and give that person your full attention. Active listening is a defined skill set, and there are additional trainings online if you need help with practicing active listening. This is one of the most critical of skills to master to help people in distress. We do not want to rush to judge the person who is thinking about dying by suicide. Instead, we want to focus on helping the person. So keep any negative thoughts to yourself. Because our job is to help and offer hope. So, after allowing the person time to share, you might ask the person one of the following questions. Will you go with me to get help? Will you let me help you get help? Will you promise me not to kill yourself until we have found some help? Now, I do want to mention that last question is not a no suicide contract that has been historically used by professionals. No suicide contracts have been found to be ineffective in preventing suicide attempts and deaths by suicide. So that question is more of a behavioral commitment to some future action, such as a promise. So for example, will you promise me to go to church? Will you promise to go to church with me this weekend? That's not a contract. That is just a pledge of commitment to do something in the future. So that's what that last question is. So we just want to mention that it is not a no suicide contract. And if you use any of these questions to persuade anyone, never leave them alone. Make sure to immediately focus on finding them help and to do it together. So the third step that anyone can take to save someone's life is to refer. So if a person answered yes to your questions regarding suicide and has also accepted to seek help, it is now time to refer them to the appropriate resources for help. So when referring people, it is important to remember that people experiencing suicidal ideations often believe they cannot be helped. So it may require more than a conversation. So the best referral involves taking that person directly to someone who can help. If you can't get that, the next best is getting a commitment from them to accept help and then make arrangements together to get that person help. And if you can't get either one of those, the third best is to give referral information to them and try to get a good faith commitment from the person that they will seek help themselves. Because any willingness to accept help at some point, even in the future, is a good outcome. Now, so here are some of the resources. So Four Rivers Behavioral Health is actually contracted with the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. So if a person calls within our region, they could be routed to our organization. All calls are routed to the nearest crisis center. And this is beneficial to callers because they will learn about resources in their area. So when they call, they're not getting someone from a whole different city. They're getting someone from our area, so they can help them link to those close by. And our center is at the Fuller Center in Mayfield. And if they don't feel comfortable calling the crisis line themselves or talking to a crisis team member, you can call on their behalf. The counselor will walk you through helping the person. And there's also a crisis text line, and this is popular among young people. And there's also the Trevor Project. There's a hotline for LGBTQ students. And then there's also a text that's available Fridays, and then a chat. And then there's also a trans laugh line. And then all the way over there's also You Are Not Alone. And we have a ton of those, so if you'll ever want You Are Not Alone cards, we have them. And they have the Suicide National Lifeline on them, as well as, it's not updated, but it also has the new 988. And so we have stickers, magnets, and a whole bunch of resources for that. And it's just good to put these in your wallet or anywhere. So if you ever come up into an emergency, you have it on hand. And because almost all efforts to persuade a person to live instead of die by suicide will be met with agreement and relief, don't hesitate to get involved and help. So it's very important to provide support to someone who is considering suicide. This can be done in a variety of ways. You can do this by telling them, I want you to live, or I'm on your side and we'll get through this. This lets them know that you care and that you are there for them. You can also provide support by getting others involved. So if you know someone who is closer to them than you, get them involved. The bigger the team, the better. Make sure to follow up. So if you helped someone through all those steps, follow up. This can be a phone call or text, or even a card in the mail, or asking that person to have lunch. Just letting them know that you care about them and that you are on their team will mean a lot to them and help them in their recovery. So now I'm going to share one final story with you about how one person can make a difference. So this is a story about another man. So from age 2 to 3, infant brother Thomas died. By age 9, great aunt, uncle, and mother dies of milk sickness within a 2-week period. After his mother's death, he was raised by his older sister, Sarah. Sarah died when he was 19. At age 26, one of his best friends died. At age 31, he experienced 6 months of serious depression. He described himself as the most miserable man living, and to remain as I am is impossible. I must die or get better. Friends were so concerned that they removed all razors, knives, pistols from his room and presents because they feared that he would die by suicide. He then had a friend, Joshua Speed, who remained with him constantly during this time. He spent over 6 months with this individual before the crisis passed. Does anybody want to guess who the person is? No. It is Abraham Lincoln. So, at age 52, he was elected our president, and he's known as one of the most beloved. And there's no indication in history that he ever suffered that degree of depression or suicide again. And so we like to mention this story because it just really shows how just one person can make a difference in someone's life. You know, his friends spent 6 months with him, and just, you know, those questions and watching out for those situations, behaviors, verbal clues that indicated to them that he was experiencing some suicide thoughts, and so they stayed with him. And so we just like to share this story just so it can kind of show how those steps can help. And so We're in our little last bit, and we talk about emotional well-being because in order to take care of others, we must take care of ourselves as well. And so we're going to briefly talk about emotional well-being and how to build your emotional well-being. So emotional well-being is one of SAMHSA's 8 major types of well-being. This includes the ability to practice stress management techniques, to be resilient, and to generate emotions that lead to good feelings. And so here are the 8 dimensions of wellness. Oh, there we go. So there is emotional, environmental, intellectual, physical, occupational, spiritual, actually social, and financial. And so we want a balance of all of the 8 dimensions and for none of them to lean too heavily on one over the other. So to ensure that our emotional well-being is balanced, we need to reduce our stress. One way to reduce stress is to incorporate positive thinking. Positive thinking is about approaching unpleasantness in a more positive and productive way, and this begins with positive self-talk. Positive thinking and self-talk can lead to many health benefits, such as increased lifespan, lower rates of depression and distress, better well-being, better cardiovascular health, and better coping skills. So how do we practice positive thinking? So you first have to identify any negative thinking. And so ask yourself, are you filtering or magnifying negative aspects of a situation and then disregarding the positive ones? Are you personalizing or blaming yourself when bad things happen? Are you catastrophizing or assuming the worst at all times? Are you polarizing the situation and making everything either black or white? So once you identify those areas where you are experiencing that negative thinking, you then focus on positive thinking. So identify those areas where you could do better, check in with yourself, be open to humor, follow a healthy lifestyle, surround yourself with positive people, and then practice positive self-talk. And I always like to mention to also give yourself grace during this part because it's easy to talk negative to ourselves, but I always like to say, don't talk to yourself if you don't talk to others that way. Treat yourself with the same respect that you treat others. And so, but it is, like I said, give yourself grace though, because it is a process. I remind myself every time I do this, and I always catch that I'm doing one of those negative thinking still. And so it's just trying to remind yourself of those. So like I said, don't say anything to yourself that you wouldn't say out loud. And then be gentle and encouraging. Give yourself grace, and then give yourself affirmation about what is good about you. And then practice gratitude daily. Self-care is the best care because when we are well, we then can help others. So to ensure that you are taking care of yourself, go enjoy your favorite hobbies. Get plenty of sleep. Nourish yourself with healthy food. And make time for fitness. It is all connected. And that is the end of our presentation. And then here are our contact emails and phone numbers. And I think that's it. So if you have any questions, we're here to answer any.